Hello and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen. I'm an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos every week for a couple of different reasons. The first of which is just to take my brain out of the mode of background work over the course of the week and move into the process of actually writing and preparing the sermon that I will preach to my weekend for the congregation. That's how that almost came out. To my congregation for the weekend. That's the first reason. And the second reason is just to allow you, the viewer, who have come across this video for whatever reason has brought you here today, to gain some different insight into the assigned text for the week. So that is why I do these. This particular Sunday, which is October 29th, 2017, Reformation Sunday, and this is a big one for us here in the Lutheran world and for some of the other Protestant denominations as well, because October 31st will mark the 500th anniversary of the event that sparked off the Protestant Reformation, and that being Martin Luther nailing his 95 Theses to the door of the chapel at Wittenberg University way back in the year 1517, item that he had anticipated or hoped to create a debate amongst the scholarly grouping there at the university to begin to reform the Catholic Church at the time. That's where Reformation comes from. It was his hope to reform the church, not to split away and form a different denomination, which is ultimately what ended up happening. But anywho, this is a big one for us, with it being the 500th anniversary, kind of a really big deal. Here in the Lutheran Church, we celebrate Reformation Sunday on the last Sunday of October every year. Now, granted, not every congregation will do that. Some will simply continue with the lectionary, and this would be, I believe, the 21st Sunday after Pentecost, I think is what that is, and that brings with it its own lectionary readings. But here in our tradition, or at least at our congregation, we do celebrate Reformation Sunday, and especially this one, as I mentioned. And because of that, there's a special set of assigned texts that we will utilize because of that. All of that being said, this assigned text, the assigned gospel, every year for Reformation Sunday does not change. And it comes out of John chapter 8, verses 31 through 36. This is a pretty commonly known passage out of John, as Jesus talks about the importance of abiding in his word, or remaining in his word, or continuing in his word. And that comes from the Greek word meno, which means to abide. And abiding is very important, or it's a very common theme in John's gospel. We hear about things, not usually things, but people abiding in many different things and many different settings. So definitely an ongoing theme. But with that, let's see. I'm going to give a little bit of background, and this is, I think, important. The setting of where this is happening. Now, we hear actually earlier on in chapter 7 of John's Gospel that Jesus is in Jerusalem for one of the festivals. There are actually 3 festivals that were celebrated in the there were a lot of festivals, but there were 3 main festivals in the Jewish year that they were expected to go to the temple and celebrate. One of the big one being Passover. The Festival of Booths, or the Festival of Tabernacles, is the other one, and the one that we're talking about here. And then there's a third one that admittedly is escaping me at the moment, and I apologize, I don't have that. But so 3 of them. And this one is the Festival of Booths. Now, what the Festival of Booths is, it's a harvest festival, or a fall festival. And over the course of the celebration, and it was instigated by God to Moses and the Israelites, clear the heck back in like Leviticus and Deuteronomy. So very, very long tradition of this festival. But for the period of 8 days, so for just over a week, to celebrate it, they stay in booths, in these little bitty, they call them tabernacles, but these little bitty booths or tents that are constructed. I don't know where they put them, if everyone was in the temple court, which was quite large, or if they were around the city. I don't really know, but God has instructed the people to part of the celebration for this 8-day period is that they stay in these booths, these little tents, and it's intended for a couple of different reasons. To remind them of the 40 years that their ancestors spent in the wilderness, particularly if we think back to Deuteronomy and the reminder for the people to as they enter into the promised land. That's what's happening in Deuteronomy. as they're reminded of the wanderings that their culture, their people have just finished or about to finish as they go into the promised land and kind of take possession of it. But so that's why they do this. And not only that, but I also think it's important that of the reminder that during that time, during that 40 years, that God dwelled among the people in the tabernacle, which was the tent where they kept the Ark of the Covenant. It was the place where Moses would go in and talk to the presence of God. The presence of God was among the people, dwelling among the people in that tabernacle. And so this is a reminder that is going out to the people as well. So that's a whole bunch of history about the festival that's been going on. So Jesus has been at that festival, and the festival has just ended. We hear that again. This is the background leading up to this passage in John 8, verse 31, that the 8 days have finished, and we hear that people kind of go out, but Jesus comes back in again the next day, and that's when this happens. Now, what happens at that point? At the beginning of chapter 8, we hear about the woman who's caught in adultery that the leaders bring to Jesus to try and trap him. So that happens. And then there's a little bit of back and forth as Jesus continues to teach and preach and everything in the temple courts. And we hear that some of the Jews have believed in him. Now, when we hear that, particularly in John's gospel, in the Greek, it's the Judai, and that usually is an indication of not like the Jewish people in general, but like the religious elite, the religious bigwigs, I tend to call. And I think that is a grouping of these Judai that are the ones who now believe in Jesus. They believe in the words that he's proclaiming. They believe in the statements that he's making, the I am statements, of which there's one that I am the light of the world. That happens in the first part of chapter 8. So all of that has been going on, leading up to this point, this teaching of Jesus, this interaction that happened. So keep in mind that we've just heard that some of the people listening to him had believed in him. And now picking up at verse 31. Then Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, if you continue, there's menu, if you eat the food that's on the menu. No, sorry, I got off. If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. They answer him, we are descendants of Abraham and have never been slaves to anyone. What do you mean by saying you will be made free? Jesus answered them, very truly I tell you, anyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not have a permanent place in the household. The son has a place there forever. So if the son makes you free, you will be free indeed. All right, so that's it. Real short reading. And there's this back and forth. And our English translation gets a little kooky. We don't hear the abide or the meno listed out as clearly as it is in the original language. Jesus says, if you meno in my word, you will be my disciples. And then later on, he says, the slave does not meno in the household forever, or into the age is the way it's always called there. But the son menos there forever. So it's abide, 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 abide. Keep abiding. And I think the overarching setting of what the Jewish people have just celebrated is so vitally important here as we consider that for 8 days, the course of this festival, they have abided in their tabernacles, in their booths. They're remembering, and for the Jewish culture, that remembering what has come before us is very vital to them. But they're remembering the time that they spent abiding in their tents as they wandered as a culture, as a people, and that God abided with them in the midst of that. Now we see a change coming about, that Jesus is reminding them that he, as God, is literally in the flesh. The word became flesh, going back to the beginning of John, and abided among them, abided among us. The word became flesh and dwelled among us, and is still dwelling among us. That's always important to remember too. And I'll probably end up referencing that in the sermon. I'm not sure yet, but I probably will. Side note, have I breathed since I started talking here? Can you tell I love John's gospel and I get really excited about it? Anywho, so Jesus is the physical embodiment of God literally abiding among us. That we have a God who is who desires to be among us, desires to be in relationship with us. And I know I come back to that a lot, but so much so that God will overcome that which causes separation, that which causes death, that which causes pain, that which causes isolation, aka sin, the power of sin in the world. God will overcome that in order to dwell among us and to be with us. That's how much God loves us and desires for that to happen. Now, there's this little back and forth exchange. Keep in mind, and I'm kind of backtracking a little bit, these people who Jesus is now talking to have just believed in his word. So this is what I imagine, or what I tend to call the spiritual 2x4. When the proclamation of the good news hits your head and your heart, and the Holy Spirit cracks you upside the head with a spiritual 2x4. That's what I tend to call it. When the gospel makes sense. That seemingly has just happened to these people. And so they are brand new believers. And there's a couple of different thoughts about what might be going on here, why Jesus tells them of the importance of abiding, of remaining connected. And we hear another I am statement in John that I am the vine, you are the branches, which is a wonderful illustration because Jesus is the source of life. God is the source of life. And if we are not connected to the source, just like a branch will die. As I think about that, I think about, I'm going to point right now, out this window that you can just barely see in the corner here. Right across the parking lot is the house where I live in, and there's maple trees in the yard. And maple trees, anytime the wind blows more than about 3 miles an hour, branches fall off because they've come disconnected and they've died. And hey, maple trees, it happens. But so I think of that, and the same thing here, that the source of life is remaining connected. I need to start that over. To live life abundantly, we need to remain connected to the source of life. And that's why Jesus is saying, remain in me, remain in my words. And you'll continue to learn that this belief, this new trust in God, it's not a one and done, but it's a lifelong thing that we continue for the rest of our lives. So that's one thought of why Jesus is saying this. Now, kind of one of the things that I've really kind of wrestled with this week is the reasoning that they give back, because when Jesus says this and then it says you'll be free, they're like, whoa, wait a second. We're descendants of Abraham. We've never been slaves to anyone. Which, side note, yeah, they have been. Their culture pretty much is always dominated by someone else. I mean, not always. There are periods of their history where they are good to go. But it's a short period of history. I mean, think back, their culture really came to prominence in Egypt when they were literally slaves. And then they've been conquered by the Assyrians. They've been conquered by the Babylonians and the Persians and the Greeks and now the Romans. So you've never been slaves to anyone? Yeah, you have. Think, if your history is so important to you, yeah, you have. Anywho, that's a side note. I think what it really comes down to is we see when they say we're descendants of Abraham, it's literally the seed of Abraham, which that's a bit of a weird thing, but it's the going back to the promise that God made to Abraham that of your descendants I will make a great nation. That covenant that God made with Abraham, that covenant that God made with Abraham and his descendants, aka the people of God, that is what they cling to. That is their root. That is their source of hope. And so when Jesus basically says what he says, the truth that he brings essentially seems to me as saying, like, your culture isn't enough. Who you are isn't enough. It's about what God says about you and trusting that that is what is true and that is what is good, despite our sinful, flawed nature. For them, that they can't seem to get past it, and there's this back and forth. And so I find myself wondering if Jesus is saying that we need to cling to his word, and his word being, if the Son sets you free, you are free indeed. That claim through Christ, that promise through Christ that we are claimed by God, we are made heirs. If the Son makes you free, you are free indeed. That's what we cling to, even when we find that tripping point or that stumbling point. For them, it was the fact that we are descendants of Abraham. That's what makes us good to go. And Jesus is saying, no, that's not what makes you good to go. What God says about you is what makes you good to go. That's the direction that I think I'm going to go with this sermon. And I know I'm cutting this off kind of abruptly as I think about this, and there's some unpacking that needs to go on there, but it seems to be telling me or telling us that we all have that tripping point. We all have that yoke of this. This is what makes me know I'm good to go. And it seems like whenever we try and place a limitation and or place a box in if you're in this box, you're good. If you're outside that box, then there's a problem. Anytime we try and create a limitation like that, we're gonna get into trouble. And because it's not about our justification, it's about God calling us justified. It's about God calling us good. It's about God claiming us, and through Christ making us heirs of the household, whatever the heck that means, into the age. So if you have thoughts, questions, comments, by all means throw them down in the comment section. We will continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a blessed week. Happy Reformation if you are from a tradition that celebrates that. If not, hey, that's cool. We'll just celebrate Christ resurrected from the dead on Sundays like we always do. Anyway, so we'll catch you next time.